October 25, 1957. Inside the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, Albert Anastasia sat in a barber chair and two gunmen walked in behind him. The boss died in public, yet the crime family that followed learned to survive by keeping its real machinery out of sight. This is why the real Gambino family story is worse than Scarface. Section 1. The barber chair that created the Gambino era. Long before John Gotti became the face of the Gambino family, Albert Anastasia stood at the top of the organization and carried a reputation tied to waterfront rackets, organized violence, and some of New York's most feared criminal networks. By 1957, power around the city's mafia families was already shifting. Anastasia's position would soon be tested in public, and the aftermath would open the way for a very different kind of boss. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia entered the barbershop inside the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. By then, he was one of the most recognizable organized crime figures in the country. Federal investigators had followed his connections for years, and his name had long been linked to the New York waterfront and to Murder Incorporated, the group of killers that became part of the mythology surrounding organized crime in the 1930s and 1940s. Whatever part of that reputation was exaggerated later, there was no serious question that Anastasia held enormous influence when he walked into the hotel that morning. Anastasia's waterfront connection gave that authority a practical base. New York's docks handled cargo, jobs, trucking, warehouses, and unions, all of which created opportunities for theft, illegal payments, and pressure over who worked and who received access. Control did not mean Anastasia personally stood on a pier, directing every transaction. It meant people connected to the organization could profit from a system where delays and labor trouble cost legitimate businesses real money. That kind of influence helps explain why his position mattered beyond the violent reputation attached to his name. The federal interest in Anastasia also shows why the family cannot be understood as a secret nobody knew existed. Investigators collected records on him for years. Newspapers reported on his associations. Anastasia's public profile was already well established. The harder problem was converting what authorities believed about a criminal hierarchy into proof of specific crimes against the person at the top. Witnesses could refuse to cooperate, street-level activity could remain several layers away, and violence could eliminate people before a case reached court. The Murder Incorporated label added another layer of mythology. It became a shorthand for organized killing connected to New York crime groups, and Anastasia's name was repeatedly attached to it. Later stories about that organization often went far beyond what courts ever established about Anastasia personally. By 1957, however, his documented public reputation for violence was already strong enough that his own murder immediately looked like a major underworld power event, rather than an ordinary homicide to investigators, reporters, and much of New York City. The organization he headed had already survived several transformations. Its roots reached back to the violent struggles that shaped the modern New York Mafia during the early 1930s. By the 1950s, it had crews involved in gambling, loans, labor influence, waterfront activity, and other rackets that depended less on one boss personally committing crimes than on layers of people collecting money beneath him. Anastasia stood at the top of that structure, but his public reputation was unusually vivid. He was known by name, photographed often, and associated in the press with a style of mob power built around fear. That made the location of his death striking. There was no hidden back room, remote road, or abandoned building. Anastasia was sitting in a barber chair inside a major Manhattan hotel. Contemporary reports described two masked gunmen entering the shop and opening fire. The attack happened quickly. Anastasia was hit several times and died there, surrounded by the ordinary equipment of a barber shop rather than the private spaces where organized crime usually tried to keep its business. The image became one of the defining crime photographs of the era. It also created a problem that no photograph could answer. Investigators knew the murder had the appearance of an organized execution, but identifying the men who fired the shots and proving who had authorized them were different tasks. The gunmen were never convicted. Later Mafia accounts, informant stories, and historical books assigned responsibility in different ways, often placing Carlo Gambino somewhere inside the power struggle that removed Anastasia. None of that produced a criminal judgment, establishing that Gambino ordered the killing. That distinction matters because the transfer of power is easier to establish than the murder conspiracy. Anastasia was dead, Carlo Gambino emerged as the leader of the organization that had been under him. Over time, the family became known by Gambino's name, which fixed the succession permanently into American organized crime history, even though the exact chain behind the barbershop killing remained unresolved. The timing also placed the murder inside a wider shift among New York's major crime families. Vito Genovese was pushing for greater control inside the organization that would later bear his own name. Frank Costello had survived a shooting earlier in 1957 and stepped away from leadership. Anastasia was killed in October. Several of the city's old power arrangements were moving at once, and the period ended with an event that exposed more of the national mafia structure than its leaders intended. 7 months before Anastasia entered the Park Sheraton, another New York leadership struggle had already turned violent. On May 2, 1957, Frank Costello was shot in the lobby of his apartment building on Central Park West. Costello survived. Federal investigators later identified Vincent Gigante as the gunman, but the prosecution failed after Costello would not identify him in court. The shooting still helped push Costello away from the leadership fight around Vito Genovese. That earlier attack matters because Anastasia was not killed during a quiet period. 2 major New York organizations were already dealing with contested leadership, federal attention, and men trying to move upward. Costello survived his shooting and stepped back. Anastasia did not survive his own attack months later. By autumn, the balance among several senior mafia figures had changed, without prosecutors winning a murder conviction for either of the violent events that helped produce it. The difference between the 2 attacks also shows why succession mattered more than any single gunman. Costello remained alive, but no longer held the same leadership position. Anastasia was dead, and the organization beneath him needed someone at the top immediately. Crews still had disputes, money still had to move, and relationships with other families still required decisions. A criminal hierarchy could not simply suspend itself while detectives tried to solve the barbershop murder. Gambino's rise becomes clearest through the visible sequence around him. Costello had been pushed from power after surviving a shooting. Anastasia was killed in October. Gambino then appeared among senior organized crime figures at Appalachian in November. No secret meeting has to be reconstructed to establish that change. The exact plot behind Anastasia's death remained unresolved, but the shift in authority around Gambino was already visible in events authorities could document. Those events also left different kinds of records. Costello's case produced a failed prosecution, Anastasia's death produced an unsolved murder file, and Appalachian produced names and associations preserved in court proceedings. Together, those records document a power shift while leaving the private decisions behind several leadership changes unresolved and never established in criminal court. On November 14, 1957, less than 3 weeks after Anastasia was killed, law enforcement officers in the small town of Appalachian, New York, noticed unusual activity around the home of Joseph Barbara. Cars with out-of-state plates were arriving. Men known to investigators were gathering there. When police moved closer, many of the attendees tried to leave quickly, some in vehicles and some on foot. The incident became one of the most famous law enforcement encounters with organized crime in the United States because it placed a large number of senior figures in one location. Federal appellate records from the cases that followed preserved the names of men encountered after the gathering. Carlo Gambino was among them. So was Paul Castellano, his relative, and a man who would become central to the family's future decades later. Their presence did not prove what had happened in the Park Sheraton barbershop. It did show that, almost immediately after Anastasia's death, Gambino was moving within a national network of senior organized crime figures, at a moment when authorities were beginning to understand the scale of that network more clearly. The Appalachian meeting also damaged a public fiction that organized crime leaders had worked hard to maintain. For years, senior law enforcement officials and politicians had sometimes treated the existence of a coordinated national mafia as exaggerated. The gathering gave investigators names, vehicles, associations, and a physical event that was difficult to dismiss. Men from different cities had not arrived in rural New York by accident. Whatever the exact agenda of the meeting, the concentration of known crime figures made the structure harder to deny. For Gambino, that exposure produced no immediate public collapse. He was not dragged from Appalachian into a murder prosecution for Anastasia's death. He did not become the subject of a successful case proving he had arranged the barbershop shooting. Instead, He moved into the leadership space Anastasia had left behind and began building a different kind of reputation. That difference is important because the family later became associated with John Gotti's visibility, but the man who gave it his name represented almost the opposite public style. Carlo Gambino was known to law enforcement. The FBI maintained extensive files on him, and authorities spent years watching his relationships and business interests. Law enforcement knew Gambino well and maintained extensive files on him. The major change was the amount of public theater surrounding the boss and the distance between the top of the family and the crimes carried out by people below. The organization itself was built to create that distance. A boss did not need to collect a gambling debt, move stolen property, threaten a contractor, or stand beside every illegal card game. Captains supervised crews. Soldiers and associates handled street-level activity. Money and information moved upward. Problems that could not be solved at one level moved to another. That structure meant removing one person did not automatically remove the businesses and relationships underneath him. Anastasia's death demonstrated the danger of concentrating too much meaning in one visible leader. His power looked personal because his reputation was personal. When he died, the organization did not disappear. The hierarchy adjusted. A new boss took the top position, and crews that had existed before the murder continued to make money afterward. The barber chair became famous. The system behind it proved harder to photograph. The immediate years after 1957 therefore matter less as a clean solution to Anastasia's murder than as evidence of what organized crime could absorb. One boss was killed in a public place. The family survived. A successor emerged. The national network around him remained active, even after Appalachian brought unprecedented attention. The institution was already showing the quality that would define the Gambino story for decades. Individual leaders could be removed while the structure beneath them adapted. The transition still involved intense rivalry around Anastasia's removal. Later informants offered detailed accounts of who supposedly approved the killing and why, but those accounts came years afterward and often conflicted. They support the broad fact of a power struggle without proving that one specific man ordered a murder that was never solved in court. The murder itself still remained unresolved in court. The certain part is enough. Anastasia entered the Park Sheraton as the boss. He died in the barber shop. Carlo Gambino became the leader who followed him. Within weeks, Gambino was among the organized crime figures identified after the Appalachian gathering. By the end of the decade, the family was entering a period in which the boss's greatest advantage would be his ability to remain important without making every act of power visible. The barber chair captures the old problem perfectly. It was an ordinary object in a public room, and for a few minutes, it became the center of a national crime story. The man who died in it had carried a reputation built partly on violence. The man who followed him would spend almost 2 decades proving that power could be harder to attack when it looked less dramatic from the outside. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Anastasia's death showed how quickly a visible boss could be removed, but it did not explain why his successor lasted so much longer. Carlo Gambino entered the same world of rivals and federal scrutiny, then reached an ending that looked nothing like the barbershop. Section 2. Carlo Gambino's Quiet Machine. Carlo Gambino inherited an organization shaken by Anastasia's murder, Appalachian, and intense federal attention. Investigators knew his name almost immediately, yet the next 19 years ended without a barbershop execution or a life sentence. His power rested on a layered hierarchy that allowed the boss to remain important, while much of the family's money was made several steps away from him. The first concrete glimpse of that new position came only weeks after Anastasia's death. On November 14, 1957, Gambino was among the men identified after the gathering at Joseph Barbara's home in Appalachian. The episode placed him inside the same national circle that law enforcement was trying to understand, and it made clear that the man rising in New York was not operating at the edge of organized crime. He was already moving among senior figures from several cities. That attention followed him. The FBI built an extensive file on Gambino over the years, recording associations, movements, suspected criminal interests, and the government's efforts to remove him from the country. Federal authorities knew who he was. Newspapers knew who he was. Other mafia leaders knew who he was. Gambino rarely turned that attention into the kind of public performance later associated with John Gotti. The family beneath him was built in layers. Captains supervised crews. Soldiers and associates handled the activities that generated cash. Gambling, loans, labor influence, theft, and business relationships could produce money without requiring the boss to stand beside the person collecting it. When disputes became too important for a crew to solve, they moved upward. When money moved, a portion could move upward too. That design separated the person at the top from many of the acts that made the organization profitable. It also made the family harder to understand from the outside. Seeing a known associate meet a captain did not automatically show what the boss had approved. Photographing Gambino with another organized crime figure showed a relationship, but not the contents of a conversation. Investigators could build patterns, but turning those patterns into proof of a particular crime required witnesses, recordings, financial evidence, or direct participation that could survive in court. Gambino's importance, therefore, rested partly on an old organizational principle. The highest-ranking person did not need to be the busiest person. A successful boss needed subordinates who could keep rackets functioning, settle ordinary problems, and bring only major issues upward. The less often the boss had to intervene personally, the fewer chances there were for a street crime to point directly at him. That did not make his position safe. Organized crime leadership carried constant risks from rivals, internal disputes, illness, and law enforcement. The years after Appalachian brought greater federal interest in the Mafia, congressional investigations, wiretaps, informants, and increasingly sophisticated prosecutions. Gambino also faced a different kind of government pressure. Federal authorities spent years trying to deport him, arguing over his immigration status, and attempting to remove him from the United States. Deportation was a useful government strategy because organized crime cases were difficult to prove when witnesses would not cooperate. Immigration proceedings offered a different path. If authorities could establish that Gambino was removable from the country, they could weaken his position without first persuading a jury that he had personally ordered a particular extortion or killing. The effort still required legal process, and Gambino's lawyers fought it over years rather than allowing a quick administrative removal. The deportation fight eventually produced a concrete appellate record. On January 7, 1970, the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit reviewed an order directing Gambino's deportation. The immigration case said he had entered the United States illegally on December 23, 1921, as a stowaway. The dispute was therefore not about proving a mafia murder or extortion. It was about whether the government could remove him through immigration law after decades in the country. The immigration case mattered because federal authorities were using a legal route separate from the rackets they associated with Gambino. The proceeding did not require a finding that he ran gambling, labor, or loan operations. The government instead had to establish the legal grounds for deportation. Gambino's lawyers could fight that order through the immigration system and the federal courts, while the criminal hierarchy beneath him continued conducting its ordinary business during the same years of legal pressure. The appellate ruling did not turn the pressure into the dramatic ending investigators wanted. Gambino remained in the United States, and the legal struggle continued to overlap with his declining health. By the middle of the 1970s, the government's effort to remove him had become another long-running process rather than a clean break in the family's leadership. That gap between official pressure and practical removal gave the hierarchy below him more time to keep its ordinary business moving. It also kept succession planning from becoming an abstract issue for the men below him. That long fight is important to the tone of his reign. There was no single showdown where Gambino defeated the government and returned to business. Pressure accumulated through investigations, hearings, medical questions, and surveillance. The family kept functioning while those processes moved slowly. A boss could spend part of his attention on lawyers and health, while experienced captains continued handling crews below. The FBI file itself reflects that persistence. One volume did not contain a secret that suddenly explained the family. Investigators accumulated pieces across time, recording meetings, associates, suspected interests, and legal developments. That kind of work could identify the structure without necessarily producing the direct evidence needed for a major criminal conviction against Gambino. It also meant the government understood his importance, long before later popular culture turned his surname into a symbol of the Mafia. Those efforts became tangled with his health. Gambino developed serious heart problems, and the government struggled to turn years of pressure into a final removal. No dramatic confrontation settled the fight. The fight continued while Gambino's health weakened, and while senior figures beneath him remained capable of handling family business without waiting for one legal proceeding to finish. Proceedings continued, lawyers fought, his health became increasingly relevant, and the criminal organization kept operating while those legal questions moved through the system. The structure around him also gave Gambino room to manage relationships rather than chase attention. His authority depended on people below him accepting that disputes could be resolved through the hierarchy. That did not eliminate violence. It created a system in which violence was one tool among several, often carried out far from the person who benefited most from the result. Money, access, labor pressure, and business connections could be just as important as a gun. This is where the later Scarface comparison begins to break down. A fictional drug empire, built around one man's appetite, becomes unstable when that man loses control. The Gambino organization could survive precisely because the boss did not have to perform every function himself. Cruz could continue taking bets, collecting loans, influencing businesses, and managing relationships, even when Gambino was dealing with doctors, lawyers, or federal scrutiny. The family also benefited from continuity. Gambino was not constantly replacing the entire structure beneath him. Senior figures built long relationships, and younger men could rise inside Cruz without changing the identity of the organization every time one person disappeared. That continuity mattered, because criminal businesses depend on memory. People need to know who can settle a dispute, who controls a territory, which crew expects payment, and which relationships are protected. One of the men inside that long-term structure was Paul Castellano. He was related to Gambino and had been identified at Appalachian in 1957. Over the years, he rose within the family, becoming an important figure in the administration. Another was Aniello Della Croce, a powerful senior member with deep influence over street crews. The existence of men like Castellano and Della Croce meant the organization did not depend on one aging boss personally handling every problem. That became more important as Gambino's health worsened. A criminal hierarchy faces the same practical problem as any organization led by an older man. Decisions still have to be made when the leader is sick. Money still has to move. Disputes still have to be settled. Crews still need supervision. A family with several experienced senior figures can keep functioning even when the boss is less active than before. The difference between influence and visibility is easy to lose because Gambino later became one of the most famous mafia names in American history. Fame after the fact can make every earlier moment look larger and more theatrical than it was. The federal record shows something more patient. Authorities collected files. They pursued deportation. They watched relationships. Gambino remained a target for years without producing the kind of final courtroom defeat that later defined Gotti. There was also no public assassination attempt that ended his reign. After the killing of Anastasia, that absence became meaningful. The man at the top of the same organization spent almost 2 decades in a world where bosses could be murdered, imprisoned, or pushed aside. Gambino's leadership still generated enemies and government attention, but the period did not end with gunmen arriving in a restaurant, hotel, or street. By 1976, his physical condition was doing what law enforcement and rivals had not. Heart disease had become a central fact of his life. He was 74 years old and living in Massapequa on Long Island. The boss who had emerged from one of the most famous mafia killings in New York was now an elderly man whose final crisis was medical rather than criminal. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died at home from heart disease. There was no crew of masked gunmen. There was no federal jury returning a life sentence. There was no photograph of his body in a public business that became the image of the family's next era. His reign ended through natural causes after roughly 19 years at the top. That fact does not prove quiet leadership alone kept him alive. No criminal organization can reduce survival to one technique. Luck, relationships, changing law enforcement priorities, health, internal politics, and the decisions of other people all mattered. The value of Gambino's era is the contrast. His authority was enormous, but the organization did not depend on making that authority visible every day. The structure also outlived him immediately. Cruz did not stop taking bets on October 15th. Loans did not vanish. Labor relationships did not dissolve. The people who had spent years answering to captains did not suddenly become strangers. The boss's death created a leadership question, not the destruction of the family. That distinction explains why succession would become more dangerous than the death itself. Gambino had helped create a system where senior figures below him carried substantial authority. Castellano represented one path through the organization, with growing connections to business and administration. Della Croce represented another, with direct influence over crews closer to the street. Both had spent years inside the same hierarchy. Neither was an outsider arriving after Gambino's death. Choosing Gambino's successor meant deciding which existing line of authority would sit above the other. The decision reached far beyond personal fame, because both senior figures already controlled important relationships inside the family. The family had survived because responsibilities were spread through layers. Once the top position became empty, those same layers created competing expectations about who should control them. The contrast with Anastasia could not have been cleaner. Anastasia died in a barber chair, with investigators trying to identify the gunmen. Gambino died at home, with federal authorities still treating him as one of the country's most important organized crime figures. The family's name had changed, its boss had lasted almost 2 decades, and the machinery underneath him was still operating. The house in Massapequa became the defining object at the end of Carlo Gambino's reign, the place where an aging boss died from heart disease after almost 19 years at the top. The organization survived that quiet ending as easily as it had survived Anastasia's violent one. What it could not avoid was the choice that followed, because a hierarchy designed to distribute power still needed one person at the top. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gambino's death removed the man who had balanced the family for almost 19 years, but it left 2 powerful lines beneath him. The next struggle began with a succession that looked orderly from the outside, while placing different crews under very different centers of authority. Section 3. The succession that split the family. Carlo Gambino's death left the family with experienced leaders, but no simple succession. Paul Castellano represented the administration, while Aniello della Croce held deep authority over crews closer to the street, including the circle where John Gotti was rising. Both men already carried real power. The arrangement that followed kept the family together on paper while creating a chain of command that would become far more important under pressure. The transition began in October 1976, immediately after Gambino died. Castellano became the new boss. Della Croce remained underboss, a position that placed him directly below the top, but also gave him practical authority over important crews. The arrangement allowed the family to keep operating without an open leadership war. It also created 2 channels through which power moved. Later histories often describe the succession as a personal insult to Della Croce, sometimes adding private promises, deathbed wishes, or conversations that are difficult to verify. None of that is necessary to understand what followed. Federal court records from the 1980s show the structure clearly enough. Castellano was the boss. Della Croce was underboss. Della Croce supervised a group of crews that included the side of the family where John Gotti would eventually rise. Della Croce had already spent years inside the organization before the succession. He had also served a prison term during the early 1970s, returning to a family that was moving toward the end of Carlo Gambino's life. When Castellano took the top position, Della Croce did not disappear or become an ordinary captain. He remained a senior figure whose authority mattered to men beneath him. That distinction is important, because Mafia hierarchies were not simply lists of titles. The route a member used to raise a problem could determine whether he was seen as following the chain of command or undermining it. A captain might have direct access to the boss, but that did not always mean bypassing the underboss was acceptable. Loyalty was tied to structure as much as personality. The crews supervised through Della Croce included men whose names would later define the Gotti era. Charles Fatico had led one of the crews. John Gotti rose within that circle. Angelo Ruggiero became one of Gotti's closest associates, and later a lieutenant in the same network. Their day-to-day criminal interests were closer to the street side of the family than to the image Castellano increasingly projected through business relationships and administration. This did not mean the 2 sides stopped working together. For most of Castellano's reign, the family functioned as one organization. Money still moved upward. Captains still answered through the hierarchy, Castellano remained boss, and Della Croce remained underboss. The tension came from the fact that different men experienced the family through different senior leaders. That kind of structure can remain stable for years, because each layer knows where to take a problem. A dispute inside a crew can be handled by the captain. A larger issue can move to the underboss or boss. The system becomes dangerous when someone skips a level, challenges who has authority, or believes the person above him no longer protects his interests. The court record also helps avoid a common mistake about Mafia titles. Calling Della Croce underboss does not mean every captain reported to him in exactly the same way, and calling Castellano boss does not mean he personally supervised every crew. The organization worked through assigned relationships. Some crews were more directly connected to particular senior figures, which is why a member could create a political problem simply by taking a dispute to the wrong person. That system gave senior leaders control over access. Reaching Castellano was itself a form of power, because not every complaint belonged at the boss's level. Della Croce could protect the authority of the captains and crews he supervised by deciding which problems moved higher. Castellano could preserve distance by allowing most issues to be resolved below him. When someone ignored that process, the act challenged more than etiquette. It suggested that an established layer of command could be bypassed whenever a captain preferred another answer. Electronic surveillance made these invisible rules unusually visible to investigators. Instead of reconstructing the hierarchy years later from informants, federal agents could hear members discussing who had the right to act and who had crossed a line. Those conversations are valuable because they were recorded before anyone involved knew they would someday be used to explain the family in court. A federal case from 1985 gives a rare look at that problem becoming concrete. Michael Caiassa was a Gambino captain. A leadership issue developed around his crew, and instead of resolving it through Della Croce, he went directly to Castellano. On paper, that might look reasonable. Castellano was the boss. Inside the hierarchy, it created a dispute over whether Caiassa had bypassed the man who was supposed to supervise him. Investigators had electronic evidence of conversations surrounding the conflict. The recordings preserved words spoken while the hierarchy was still functioning normally, long before later memoirs tried to reconstruct the same period. Della Croce and Angelo Ruggiero discussed Caiazza's decision to go around the underboss. Their frustration was not abstract. It concerned authority, procedure, and the message created when a captain chose one senior leader over another. Della Croce eventually removed Caiazza's authority within the family. The decision showed that the underboss's power was not ceremonial. A captain could reach the boss and still face consequences for ignoring the line of supervision beneath him. The incident also demonstrated how Castellano and Della Croce could both hold real power without the family formally splitting into two organizations. The Caiazza episode also landed at the worst possible moment for a hierarchy that depended on Della Croce as a bridge. By 1985, the underboss was an older man whose authority still reached directly into the crews around Gotti and Ruggiero. The recorded dispute showed those men defending the importance of his position, while Castellano remained the unquestioned boss above him. The family could contain both sources of authority because Della Croce was still present to make the chain work. The recordings therefore preserve more than an argument over one captain. They capture the rule that kept a dangerous division manageable. Men close to Gotti could accept Castellano's formal authority, while still expecting their own problems to move through Della Croce. Castellano could remain above many street disputes, while Della Croce enforced discipline below. Once that middle layer disappeared, the same men would have to deal with the boss more directly, with far less room for a trusted senior figure to absorb the conflict. That made Della Croce's continued presence an operating fact, not merely a title on an organizational chart. For most of the 9 years before Gotti's takeover, the family continued operating while carrying an internal fault line that surfaced whenever the chain of command was tested. The arrangement preserved cooperation, but every dispute over access exposed the political cost of choosing one chain of command over another. Those moments accumulated importance because the men closest to Della Croce were also the men who would later feel threatened by decisions coming from Castellano's side of the administration. Castellano's leadership style added another difference. His criminal authority remained real, but his interests increasingly intersected with legitimate-looking businesses, construction, labor relationships, and financial arrangements. He was not abandoning traditional rackets. Federal cases continued to identify gambling, illegal lending, extortion, and other crimes around the family. The difference was that Castellano's world placed more emphasis on businesses where influence could be exercised through contracts, companies, unions, and people several steps removed from street collections. Della Croce's side contained crews with a more direct relationship to gambling, loans, theft, and the daily enforcement that kept those activities profitable. Castellano remained the boss of a criminal family, while Della Croce remained a senior mafia leader inside the same organization. Their strongest relationships and responsibilities were concentrated in different parts of the family, creating a practical divide without turning them into leaders of separate organizations. John Gotti grew inside that arrangement. He did not arrive in the mid-1980s as a stranger who suddenly challenged a stable administration. He had spent years in a crew that answered through Della Croce. That gave him a senior protector and a clear place inside the hierarchy. It also meant that when problems developed between people around Gotti and Castellano's administration, the underboss became crucial to keeping those problems from turning into a direct confrontation. The government was beginning to make that balancing act harder. Electronic surveillance and informants were exposing conversations that previously would have remained private. Investigators could hear captains complain about leadership, track who met whom, and build cases around the relationships between crews. The hierarchy that had once protected the boss by creating distance also generated evidence once federal agents found ways to listen inside it. Angelo Ruggiero became especially important because federal investigators targeted conversations around him. He was close to Gotti, tied to Della Croce's side, and involved in activity that created serious legal risk. The details of those cases would later feed the conflict with Castellano, but the important fact in this period is that law enforcement pressure was reaching directly into a crew whose protection depended heavily on Della Croce's position. At the same time, Castellano faced his own major federal exposure. Prosecutors were building cases involving the family and the Mafia Commission. Electronic surveillance reached his home. The boss had reason to care about discipline, secrecy, and any activity that could produce more evidence. The men under Della Croce had reason to fear what would happen if Castellano decided their conduct endangered the entire administration. This created a problem that no formal title could solve. The family needed discipline from the top, but discipline threatened people whose loyalty ran strongly through the underboss. Della Croce could mediate because he had standing with both levels. He was part of the administration, yet he supervised the crews most likely to resist Castellano's decisions. His continued presence made the arrangement workable even when neither side trusted the other completely. The 1985 Caiazza dispute shows exactly why that role mattered. A captain went directly to the boss. Della Croce treated the move as a challenge to his authority. Ruggiero understood the insult. The problem was resolved without gunfire, but only because the hierarchy still contained someone strong enough to enforce the boundary between the two lines. By the middle of 1985, the federal pressure surrounding the family was becoming harder to ignore. Castellano was under indictment in a major organized crime case. Other senior mafia leaders were also facing prosecution. Crews beneath him were dealing with their own investigations. The family had survived nearly a decade under the Castellano and Della Croce arrangement, but the same structure that distributed power was now carrying several legal and personal conflicts at once. The succession created a contradiction that would define the next decade. Carlo Gambino's system had been durable, partly because experienced leaders below him could carry responsibility. After his death, that strength produced two powerful centers inside one chain of command. As long as Castellano and Della Croce both remained in place, the organization could absorb the tension. Remove one of them, and the protection separating the boss from the most dissatisfied crews would disappear. That is why the Caiazza episode matters more than a list of rumors about who disliked whom. It is recorded evidence of a captain being punished for crossing an internal line that outsiders could barely see. Castellano held the top title. Della Croce still controlled access and discipline for men beneath him. Gotti was rising inside that second line, not outside the family. The organization could live with that arrangement, because every person understood the route a problem was supposed to travel. The danger came when the route itself stopped working. By 1985, federal cases were pressing from outside, while resentment and fear were growing inside. The two lines of authority that had coexisted since 1976 were about to lose the man who connected them. A single dispute from this period captures the structure more clearly than any famous murder scene. A captain went to the boss and discovered that reaching the top did not protect him from the underboss below it. Kayatsa's punishment showed how the family really worked, and why one succession decision had left more than one center of power inside the same organization. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The divided hierarchy mattered, because Castellano was building power through businesses and relationships that looked far removed from a street crew. Federal investigators followed those connections until the distance between the boss and the money began shrinking inside his own home. Section 4. The boss who turned crime into business. Paul Castellano is often remembered as the boss murdered outside a steakhouse, but that ending can hide what made his administration important. His era placed the Gambino family deeper inside companies, construction, labor relationships, loans, and other systems where criminal pressure could resemble ordinary business from a distance. The same approach created records, meetings, and conversations that federal investigators could follow much closer to the top. The financial side of Castellano's legal history was visible even before he became boss. In the mid-1970s, federal prosecutors charged him and several other defendants in a case built around an alleged unlawful lending enterprise. Castellano also faced tax-related accusations. Those charges did not establish every claim prosecutors made, but they showed where investigators were looking. Money, business relationships, and organized lending were already part of the government's picture of his activity. When Castellano took over the Gambino family after Carlo Gambino's death, those interests fit a criminal organization that had learned how valuable legitimate industries could be. A street robbery produces cash once. Influence over a contractor, union, trucking company, or supplier can produce money again and again. The people collecting it may wear work clothes or suits instead of carrying weapons, but the underlying advantage comes from knowing that refusing a demand can bring economic pressure or violence. Construction was especially useful because large New York projects brought several vulnerable systems together. Contractors needed concrete, trucks, workers, union cooperation, financing, and schedules that could not tolerate long delays. If organized crime figures could influence even one part of that chain, they could create leverage over companies with enormous amounts of money at stake. A construction project is also unusually sensitive to timing. Concrete has to arrive when crews and forms are ready. Labor has to be available in the correct sequence. Delays spread costs across several companies at once. That made construction attractive to organized crime, because influence over one bottleneck could affect an entire job. A demand backed by the possibility of a work stoppage or supply problem did not need to sound like a traditional street threat to create pressure. The economic value also encouraged cooperation among crime families. A major project could touch territories, unions, suppliers, and contractors associated with different organizations. Fighting over every contract would damage the income available to all of them. An allocation system could reduce that conflict by deciding in advance which companies received certain work and what payment organized crime expected in return. Federal evidence concerning the Concrete Club described major pouring contracts where the concrete portion exceeded $2 million. The specific threshold matters because it shows prosecutors were not describing a few envelopes passed around small neighborhood jobs. They were investigating a system attached to large commercial projects where the money available from one decision could dwarf the proceeds of ordinary street crime. The wider Mafia Commission prosecution later exposed one version of that system. Federal evidence described a group of concrete companies, sometimes called the Club. Major concrete pouring contracts above a certain value were allocated among companies within the arrangement. Organized crime figures could influence who received the work and extract payments from the process. The scheme involved more than the Gambino family, which is exactly why it mattered. Construction created a place where separate mafia organizations had reasons to cooperate instead of fight. The commission itself functioned as a way to manage conflicts among major families. It could help settle disputes that crossed organizational lines, approve certain leadership changes, and reduce the risk that competition over profitable businesses turned into constant warfare. For investigators, that structure created a larger target. If prosecutors could prove that bosses were coordinating criminal business, they no longer had to treat every extortion, contract, and labor dispute as an isolated local crime. The federal government had a tool built for that problem. The racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations law allowed prosecutors to charge people for participating in a criminal enterprise through a pattern of crimes. In simple terms, the government could focus on the organization and the relationships connecting different acts rather than needing to pretend every crime was a separate story. That made hierarchy itself important evidence. Castellano's position placed him directly in the kind of hierarchy prosecutors wanted to map. Captains below him supervised crews. Crews generated money. Senior figures handled disputes that could affect several people or businesses. The boss did not need to make every threat personally. If the government could prove that decisions and money moved through the structure, distance from the street became less protective than it had been in earlier decades. Federal investigators therefore needed more than photographs of Castellano entering restaurants or meeting known associates. They needed conversations. They needed to hear how senior figures discussed businesses, crews, money, and other families when they believed no investigator was listening. That effort eventually brought the investigation to Castellano's own residence on Staten Island. Obtaining permission to listen inside a private home required court approval. Federal judges issued a series of electronic surveillance orders covering Castellano's residence between late 1982 and July 1983. The process itself shows how carefully the government was trying to reach the administration. Agents could not simply enter the house and plant equipment because they suspected the owner was a mafia boss. They had to convince judges that legal requirements for electronic surveillance had been met. Even after receiving permission, the operation was difficult. Agents initially struggled to make the covert entry needed to install the listening equipment. That delay meant the first orders did not immediately produce usable conversations. Actual surveillance began only after agents finally gained access in March 1983. From that point, a private place became an evidence source. Conversations inside the house could capture details that street surveillance could not. A photograph might show who arrived. A recording could show who was treated as important, which disputes required attention, what names were used, and how senior figures understood the organization around them. The value of that material became clear later, when recordings from Castellano's home were played in federal court. One documented conversation was captured on June 3, 1983. The significance was larger than any single sentence on a tape. A boss whose authority depended partly on layers of separation had lost some of that separation inside the place where he believed high-level discussions could remain private. The investigation also intersected with the larger commission case. Prosecutors were not simply trying to prove that Castellano knew gamblers or loan sharks. They were building a picture of New York organized crime as a set of families whose leaders could coordinate over construction, labor, and other profitable areas. Electronic evidence from senior figures helped turn a hidden governing structure into something a jury could hear. Castellano was charged in that federal prosecution, but his legal status requires care. He never received a verdict in the commission trial because he was murdered before the case reached that point for him. That means the allegations in the indictment cannot be retold, as if a jury convicted Castellano of every part of the commission scheme. The case is still useful because it shows what federal prosecutors believed they could prove and how far their investigation had reached before his death. The same caution applies to the image of Castellano as a boss who wanted to make the family legitimate. He remained the alleged leader of a criminal organization involved in traditional rackets. Business interests did not replace gambling, loans, extortion, theft, or violence. They expanded the places where the family's influence could be useful. That expansion explains why an ordinary company could matter as much as a social club. A contractor controlled by or dependent on organized crime could provide jobs, invoices, access to projects, and ways to hide money. Union influence could create leverage without an explicit threat being made in every conversation. A truck that did not arrive, a work crew that did not show up, or a problem with labor could cost a company enough money to make cooperation seem cheaper than resistance. The power was therefore cumulative. No single construction contract explains the Gambino family's strength. The advantage came from relationships spread across crews and industries, where one favor could be repaid by another and where the threat behind the arrangement did not need to be stated each time. That is why investigators cared about hierarchy. They wanted to show that the people benefiting from the system were connected even when the street-level acts looked separate. Castellano's home surveillance threatened exactly that defense. A boss could claim distance from a bookmaker or contractor. It became harder to claim distance from conversations held inside his own residence, with people involved in the organization. The recordings did not automatically prove every crime, but they gave prosecutors a way to connect the administration to the world below it, using the participants' own words. The house itself became an unusual symbol of the era. Castellano's Staten Island mansion represented wealth and separation from the street. It was the kind of place that fit the image of a boss who had moved toward businesses and administration, rather than spending every evening in a neighborhood club. Federal agents turned that same private setting into a source of evidence. The irony went further. The organization had evolved because distance protected leaders. Captains and soldiers could handle ordinary criminal work, while the boss focused on larger relationships. Electronic surveillance was changing the value of that distance. If investigators could listen where the larger decisions happened, they could skip several layers of the hierarchy without arresting everyone below first. That was also happening at a time when law enforcement had become more willing to build cases around long conspiracies. The government could spend years collecting evidence, combining business records, surveillance, informants, and separate crimes into one racketeering prosecution. A family that survived because its activities were distributed across many people now faced a law designed to treat those distributed activities as parts of one enterprise. Castellano's position made the risk especially serious because the commission investigation reached beyond the Gambino family. A conversation about construction or another boss could help prosecutors explain relationships between organizations. A meeting that looked like ordinary social contact could become more important once investigators understood the business being discussed around it. The threat from federal law enforcement did not immediately change the family's internal structure. Castellano remained boss. Della Croce remained underboss. Gotti remained beneath them. Cruz continued making money while prosecutors listened. Yet the pressure began changing the calculations inside the organization, because every investigation raised the question of which activities had exposed whom. That question became dangerous around the street crews supervised through Della Croce. Some of the men closest to Gotti were involved in investigations of their own. Castellano had reasons to fear conduct that might bring greater federal attention to the entire family. The men beneath Della Croce had reasons to fear what Castellano might do if he believed their activity threatened his administration. The business model, therefore, created a second contradiction. It could generate enormous influence through legitimate industries, but it also made discipline more important. A boss involved in complicated financial relationships could not afford a crew creating uncontrolled exposure. When federal agents were already listening inside his home, every new investigation had the potential to connect street activity to the administration. That tension was already clearly visible in the DeMeo crew. Roy DeMeo's group operated within the same family during the same broad period, but its federal record looked very different from the world of concrete contracts and private business discussions. Prosecutors described a crew tied to stolen cars, extortion, narcotics, and a large number of alleged murders. The family could contain both worlds at once because the hierarchy linked them without making them look identical. Castellano's business era reached a critical turn away from any construction site. Federal agents finally gained access to his residence and began listening in March 1983. The organization had spent decades using hierarchy to keep the boss away from ordinary crimes. Investigators had found a way to move evidence upward through the structure and into conversations much closer to the boss himself. By the time recordings from the house reached court, the private setting had lost the protection it was supposed to provide. A mansion that symbolized distance from street crime had become part of the government's attempt to prove the relationships at the top. The family still had money, crews, and businesses. What it was losing was the assumption that important conversations could remain safely above the people investigating them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The recordings reached toward the administration, but another federal case showed what existed much lower in the same hierarchy. Under Castellano's business-heavy image sat a crew whose money came with a level of violence that ordinary contracts could never hide. Section 5, the DeMeo crew, and the violence underneath Castellano's administration, could talk about construction, companies, loans, and labor, while one crew beneath it operated in a much rougher world. Roy DeMeo sat below Captain Anthony Gaggi inside the Gambino hierarchy, and federal prosecutors later described their crew through stolen cars, extortion, drugs, obstruction, and dozens of alleged racketeering acts. Following that crew shows what the business image did not remove from the family. Roy DeMeo grew up in Brooklyn and entered organized crime through money-making activities that fit the lower levels of a mafia crew. He ran loans, built relationships around stolen property, and eventually came under Anthony Gaggi, a Gambino captain. That connection mattered because it placed DeMeo inside a chain of command. He was not simply an independent criminal using the Gambino name after the fact. A federal court later described the structure directly. DeMeo acted as the street leader of the crew. Gaggi was the captain above him. Paul Castellano was the boss above Gaggi. That simple hierarchy provides a more useful picture than the mythology that later surrounded DeMeo. The crew's violence and theft existed inside the same organization whose administration was dealing with construction, labor, and high-level mafia politics. The crew became especially profitable through stolen vehicles. Cars taken in the United States could be altered, moved, sold, or shipped through networks that cross state and national lines. A stolen car is not only a piece of property. It carries a vehicle identification number, registration documents, title records, insurance records, and a physical identity that has to be changed or hidden if the vehicle is going to be resold safely. That made the operation complicated enough to require cooperation. People were needed to steal vehicles, alter identifying information, prepare documents, find buyers, arrange transportation, and move money. The more successful the scheme became, the more participants it required. That growth created profit, but it also created witnesses and records that investigators could eventually use. The Gemini Lounge in Brooklyn became closely associated with DeMeo and members of his crew. The location later gained a grim reputation in books and testimony, but its basic importance was practical. It gave members and associates a regular place to meet, talk, and conduct business. A neighborhood bar could sit at the center of activity that extended far beyond the neighborhood because the crew itself was connected to a larger criminal organization. The stolen vehicle business also shows why a crew could become more than a group of local thieves. Moving cars successfully required people with different skills and different levels of knowledge. One participant might obtain a vehicle, another might alter identifying numbers. Someone else could handle paperwork or transportation. Buyers could be far from the place where the car was taken. Each additional step created profit while also making the operation dependent on a wider circle of people. For a mafia crew, that network could be protected through reputation and hierarchy. Participants knew they were dealing with people connected to a larger organization, which could discourage theft from the scheme or cooperation with police. The same connection also increased federal interest because the operation could be treated as part of an enterprise rather than a series of unrelated stolen cars. When investigators began combining those pieces, the case reached beyond DeMeo personally. That became important after his death because prosecutors still had defendants, records, witnesses, and criminal acts to work with. A crew leader could be murdered, but a racketeering investigation built around the enterprise did not die with him. Federal prosecutors eventually built a racketeering case around the crew that alleged 80 separate racketeering acts. The indictment included stolen property, extortion, narcotics offenses, bribery, fraud, obstruction, and 26 alleged murders. That number needs careful wording. It was the government's racketeering allegation, not a finding that Roy DeMeo personally murdered 26 people, and not proof of the much larger totals repeated in later popular accounts. The distinction does not make the crew's record mild. The federal case still described a group in which violence appeared repeatedly, beside profit-making crimes. The indictment itself already alleged 26 murders among 80 racketeering acts, so later inflated estimates are unnecessary. That scale alone explains why investigators treated the crew as unusually dangerous within the larger Gambino organization during the early 1980s. The hierarchy above DeMeo also matters because the crew's usefulness created a problem for the administration. A violent group can enforce debts, protect stolen property schemes, intimidate competitors, and remove people considered threats. Those functions can make a crew profitable. The same behavior can attract the kind of attention that threatens everyone above it once police and federal agents begin building a wider case. By the early 1980s, that pressure was increasing. Investigators were looking closely at the stolen car operation and at people connected to DeMeo. A federal grand jury had subpoenaed him in connection with the investigation. The crew's activities were no longer safely buried among ordinary street crimes. They were becoming part of a case that could reach through multiple participants and potentially expose the chain above them. That was a dangerous position inside a family where the boss was already facing growing federal scrutiny. Castellano had his own problems with electronic surveillance and major organized crime investigations. A crew whose record included stolen vehicles and repeated allegations of murder created exactly the kind of uncontrolled exposure a senior administration would want contained. What happened next has generated decades of confident explanations, but the legal record is less complete. Investigators and later Mafia accounts believe DeMeo had become a liability to his own organization. Different accounts identify different men as the people who approved or carried out his killing. No murder prosecution ever established the full chain beyond a reasonable doubt. The uncertainty also reveals something about the organization. DeMeo spent years inside a crew whose usefulness depended partly on other people fearing what it could do. When he became the person under pressure, the secrecy that had protected the crew also made his final movements, and the exact chain behind his killing, difficult to reconstruct with certainty. On January 10, 1983, DeMeo disappeared. According to accounts preserved in later reporting, he had expressed fear to his family that he was in danger. He left and did not return. For 10 days, there was no public resolution to what had happened. His Cadillac eventually became the answer. On January 20, the car was found at a boat club in the Sheepshead Bay area of Brooklyn. DeMeo's body was inside the trunk. He had been shot multiple times. Cold January temperatures had slowed decomposition, leaving investigators with the unmistakable fact that the crew's street leader had been killed and concealed inside his own vehicle. One detail from accounts of the discovery has remained attached to the scene for years. A chandelier DeMeo had intended to have repaired was also inside the Cadillac. It cuts against the mythology surrounding him for a moment in later accounts. A man connected to a crew accused of extraordinary violence had left home carrying an ordinary household item. 10 days later, the same car held his body. The killing did not end the investigation into his crew. That is one of the most important consequences. Federal prosecutors continued pursuing the people and businesses connected to the stolen vehicle operation and other rackets. Later trials produced racketeering convictions against members and associates. Removing the street leader did not erase the evidence already collected or stop the government from reconstructing the enterprise. The later prosecutions show why DeMeo's death failed to erase the crew's history. By 1989, federal juries were still returning racketeering convictions against Gambino members and associates tied to the criminal businesses investigators had followed through the decade. The cases involved stolen vehicles, alongside loans, narcotics, extortion, and other rackets. DeMeo could no longer be prosecuted or questioned, but the enterprise had left enough people and evidence behind for the government to keep moving through the organization years after his body was found. The surviving case was therefore larger than the man whose name had first made the crew notorious. That pattern mirrors the larger Gambino family in miniature. A leader disappears, but the activities beneath him leave participants, records, money trails, and relationships. Investigators can continue moving through those pieces after the person at the center is dead. Criminal organizations gain durability from distributing work across many people, yet the same distribution gives prosecutors multiple paths once cooperation or evidence begins to accumulate. The DeMeo case also complicates the idea that Castellano's business interests made the family less violent. A boss can prefer companies, construction, and financial influence, while still benefiting from crews capable of direct enforcement. The two systems are not opposites. They can support one another. Business pressure is more effective when people believe refusal has consequences beyond losing a contract. At the same time, violence can become bad business when it attracts too much attention. A crew that once solved problems can become the problem if prosecutors begin treating its crimes as part of a larger enterprise. That is the tension DeMeo represents. The skills that made his group valuable could also make everyone connected to it vulnerable. Federal racketeering law made that vulnerability worse. Investigators did not need to prove that Castellano personally stole a car, or that Gaggi personally committed every act attributed to crew members. They could try to show how people participated in an enterprise through a pattern of criminal activity. The hierarchy that gave orders and money a route upward could give prosecutors a route upward too. That threat was becoming visible across the family during the same period. Castellano's house was under electronic surveillance. Other crews were under investigation. The commission case was developing. The federal government was learning how to treat organized crime as an organization rather than a collection of unrelated defendants. For the men around Gotti, this created another source of fear. They could see what happened when a crew attracted too much attention. They could see a street leader disappear as federal pressure increased. They could also see that the investigation did not stop after his death. Every crew operating outside the administration's preferred boundaries had reason to wonder how Castellano would respond if its problems threatened to travel upward. DeMeo's death revealed something larger than another unsolved mafia hit. His killing remained unresolved, but the federal record around his crew exposed a deeper contradiction. The Gambino family could contain a sophisticated business administration and an intensely violent crew at the same time, because both were connected through the same hierarchy and depended on the organization for protection and profit. The body in the Cadillac also shows the limits of that hierarchy. Being useful did not create permanent protection. A crew leader could make money, enforce decisions, and build a frightening reputation, then become disposable once the risk around him grew too large. The organization survived by valuing the structure above the individual. That logic would soon reach much higher than DeMeo. By 1985, Castellano's administration was facing major federal cases. Gotti's circle was dealing with investigations of its own. Della Croce remained the senior figure who could mediate between the boss and the men most likely to resist him. The family had already shown that a dangerous subordinate could disappear when pressure increased. The question was what happened when the threatened men believed the pressure was coming from the boss himself. No verified record allows a clean statement of who sat in a room and decided Roy DeMeo would die. The exact order remains unresolved. A street leader operating under a Gambino captain vanished in January 1983, and his body was discovered 10 days later in the trunk of his Cadillac. That established outcome carries more weight than any later attempt to turn an unresolved chain of authorization into certainty. The chandelier beside DeMeo gave the discovery an ordinary detail beside an extraordinary death. It belonged to a routine errand in an ordinary car. The federal record around DeMeo describes a criminal enterprise filled with theft, extortion, drugs, obstruction, and alleged murders. The household object left in the trunk sat beside the consequence of a world where ordinary business and extreme violence occupied the same organization. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. DeMeo's death showed that a crew leader could become expendable when danger moved upward. 2 years later, the family faced a larger rupture after the senior figure protecting Gotti's side disappeared, leaving the boss and his most dissatisfied crews without the buffer that had kept them apart. Section 6. The coup that broke the commission's rules. By late 1985, the Gambino family still had one boss, but its internal balance depended heavily on Agnello Della Croce. Castellano controlled the administration, while Della Croce supervised the crews around John Gotti. Federal investigations were pressing both sides, and trust was thinning. The structure held as long as the underboss could stand between them. When Della Croce died, that buffer vanished almost immediately. Della Croce had spent years as the senior figure closest to Gotti's side of the organization. His authority did not make Castellano less of a boss, but it gave men under him a route through the hierarchy. Problems that might otherwise have gone directly to Castellano could be handled or carried upward by someone those crews trusted. That arrangement became more important as federal pressure increased. Castellano was facing a major organized crime prosecution, and new investigators had penetrated conversations close to the administration. People around Gotti were dealing with serious investigations of their own. The family had reasons to demand discipline, and the men under scrutiny had reasons to fear what the administration might do if it decided they had become liabilities. Della Croce's position helped contain that conflict, because he belonged to both sides of it. He was part of the administration and also the senior figure supervising the crews most likely to resist Castellano. For years, that made him a practical bridge between men whose interests were not always aligned. On December 2, 1985, Della Croce died from natural causes. His death did not create the tension inside the family, but it removed the man best positioned to manage it. Gotti and the people closest to him were now exposed directly to Castellano's authority at the same moment when they were already worried about investigations and possible discipline. The timing was especially dangerous because Castellano's legal position was deteriorating. Federal prosecutors had charged him in the Mafia Commission case. Electronic surveillance had produced conversations from inside his home. The government was trying to prove that bosses from several New York families coordinated criminal business. A leader facing that kind of case had every reason to care about what information another crew might generate. Gotti's position carried its own risks. He had risen through the crew supervised by Della Croce, not through Castellano's business-centered inner circle. The people around him included men whose legal exposure could create problems for the family. After Della Croce died, there was no equally powerful senior figure between Gotti's group and the boss. Within 2 weeks, that internal problem turned into a plan to remove Castellano. The exact private conversations that produced the decision were later reconstructed through testimony and federal cases, while the strongest legal conclusion came years afterward. Gotti's responsibility for arranging the killing did not remain a rumor. A federal jury ultimately convicted him of ordering the murders of Castellano and Thomas Bellotti in a case built around wider racketeering. Bellotti had become an important figure close to Castellano and was serving as underboss after Della Croce's death. On December 16, 1985, Castellano and Bellotti traveled into Manhattan for a dinner meeting at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street. The restaurant was a public place in one of the busiest parts of the city, which made the coming attack especially risky. At approximately 5:30 in the evening, the two men arrived outside the restaurant. Federal court records describe 3 assailants opening fire as Castellano and Bellotti left their vehicle. Both men were killed on the street before they could enter Sparks. The scene immediately became national news. Castellano was one of the most important organized crime defendants in the country and was awaiting trial in a case designed to strike at the Mafia Commission itself. His body now lay outside a Manhattan steakhouse before that prosecution could produce a verdict against him. Castellano's death also interrupted one of the government's biggest attempts to prosecute Mafia leadership as a group. He had already been charged in the Commission case, which was designed to use racketeering law against senior figures from several New York families. His murder meant jurors would never return a verdict on those Commission charges against him personally. The case continued against other defendants, but Castellano's part ended on the sidewalk before the courtroom could settle it. That timing made Gotti's move more complicated than replacing an aging boss in a stable period. The federal government was already trying to map the commission, record senior conversations, and connect leadership to industries and crimes beneath it. Killing Castellano removed one defendant from that prosecution, while putting a new boss at the center of an event investigators could examine. Gotti inherited the family. At the same moment, law enforcement was becoming better equipped to explain what the title meant. For Gotti, the killing worked in the immediate sense. He took control of the Gambino family after Castellano's death. The man who had spent years rising through Della Croce's side of the organization had removed the boss above him and reached the position that Castellano had held since 1976. The federal case years later gave the murder a legal conclusion. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on 13 counts, including responsibility for ordering the Castellano and Bellotti killings. That verdict is what allows the event to be described firmly. The evidence crossed the line from mafia allegation into a finding by a federal jury. The larger danger came from the way the takeover had happened. Mafia families did not operate under written corporate bylaws, but testimony and later federal findings described rules governing leadership and major acts of violence. One of the most important was that a sitting boss was not supposed to be killed without approval from the commission. That rule protected every boss, not only Castellano. If a captain could murder his own boss and simply take the position afterward, then leadership across all 5 families became less secure. The commission's interest was therefore larger than sympathy for Castellano. An unauthorized assassination threatened the system that kept internal ambition from turning every succession into open warfare. The rule also explains why the reaction could not be reduced to friendship or revenge. A boss in another family did not need to care personally about Castellano to care about the precedent. Commission approval placed a barrier between ambitious subordinates and the men above them. If Gotti could ignore that barrier and keep the title without consequence, every boss had reason to worry about his own captains learning the same lesson. That made the dispute institutional. The Gambino family had changed its leader, but the method challenged a system used by several families to manage succession and violence. The commission could not reverse the murder. It could only decide how the other organizations would respond to the man who benefited from it. The later Gigante prosecution is especially valuable because jurors did not simply accept every old mafia accusation presented to them. They found some alleged conduct proved and rejected, or declined to find other homicide claims proved. That selective result strengthens the Gotti conspiracy finding. It came from a proceeding where the jury distinguished between allegations instead of treating organized crime testimony as one undivided story. Later federal litigation involving Vincent Gigante established that the Castellano killing had not received commission approval. Evidence at Gigante's trial also established a conspiracy among senior mafia figures to kill Gotti after the takeover. That distinction is important because it moves the retaliation beyond general mafia rumor. Jurors evaluating Gigante's conduct found the Gotti murder conspiracy proved even while rejecting or declining to find several other old homicide allegations. The existence of that conspiracy did not mean every violent event that followed could be assigned to the same people with certainty. Organized crime cases often contain a mix of proved conduct, cooperating witness accounts, investigative theories, and unresolved crimes. Those categories remain separate, especially when testimony goes beyond any later verdict or conviction. The first dramatic sign of retaliation came only months after Gotti became boss. Frank DeCicco had become Gotti's underboss and was one of the senior figures in the new administration. On April 13, 1986, DeCicco left a meeting at a Brooklyn social club and approached a car outside. A bomb exploded, killing him and injuring another man. The bombing was an unusually public act of mafia violence in New York, and investigators immediately examined whether it was revenge for Castellano's murder. An FBI spokesman at the time said that retaliation for the unauthorized killing was one possible motive. Later mafia accounts became more specific, but the bombing itself never produced the same clear murder conviction that the Sparks killings eventually did. That difference needs to stay visible. The conspiracy to kill Gotti was established in later federal proceedings. The precise chain behind the bomb that killed DeCicco remained less certain. Treating the two as identical would turn a strong legal record into an overstatement. For the Gambino family, the bombing showed the cost of Gotti's shortcut to power. He had solved the internal succession by removing Castellano, but the act created enemies outside the family and instability inside his own administration. DeCicco was dead only 4 months after the takeover, forcing Gotti to rebuild senior leadership almost immediately. The coup also changed the family's relationship with public attention. Carlo Gambino had spent nearly 19 years at the top without a leadership murder defining his reign. Castellano's succession had been orderly in public even when the family carried internal tensions. Gotti's era began with a double killing outside a famous Manhattan restaurant and was followed by a car bombing in Brooklyn. That visibility did not automatically weaken him. In the short term, it strengthened his reputation. He had taken control of one of the country's most powerful mafia families and survived the immediate consequences. The fact that Castellano was already facing major federal charges also meant Gotti inherited an organization whose old administration was under extraordinary pressure. Yet the way Gotti took power made secrecy harder. Investigators now had a clear reason to examine the people who benefited from Castellano's death. Other mafia leaders had a clear reason to watch the new boss. Journalists had a clear reason to follow him. Every meeting, court appearance, and public event carried more meaning because the leadership change had been so violent and visible. The coup also exposed a deeper contradiction in mafia governance. The commission existed partly to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral move, yet it could not simply remove Gotti without creating another wave of violence and law enforcement attention. Retaliation had to be planned through the same secretive channels that federal investigators were increasingly learning to penetrate. That gave Gotti time. He was able to consolidate control of the Gambino family, appoint senior figures, and operate as boss. The plot against him did not immediately succeed. The organization continued making money. From the outside, his survival could look like proof that the coup had worked without lasting cost. The cost was accumulating in less visible ways. Federal agents were already investigating organized crime at the highest level. Gotti's name now sat at the center of a leadership murder that other senior mafia figures considered unauthorized. The family had moved from a boss whose private home was secretly recorded into an era where the boss himself would become one of the most watched organized crime figures in America. The Sparks scene captures the transition. Castellano had spent years increasing the distance between administration and street crime, then died on a Manhattan sidewalk in a killing later proved to have been ordered by one of his own captains. The hierarchy survived again, but this time the man taking over had broken the rule designed to make bosses safer from the men beneath them. That is what made the coup more dangerous than a simple change of leadership. Gotti gained the title and inherited the family. He also inherited a murder conspiracy against himself, a damaged relationship with other mafia leaders, and federal interest intensified by the spectacle of the takeover. Castellano and Bellotti never reached the dinner meeting waiting inside Sparks. Their bodies remained outside the restaurant where the leadership transfer became public. The shooting solved Gotti's internal problem in a few seconds, but it also turned the new boss into a target for people who believed his promotion threatened the rules protecting every other boss. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gotti survived the immediate retaliation and began building a public image no Gambino boss before him had carried. The same visibility that made him look untouchable gave investigators something equally valuable: routines, meeting places, associates, and years of opportunities to keep watching. Section 7. The Boss Who Made the Family Visible. John Gotti reached the top through a murder that made front pages, then became a boss whose face stayed there. Expensive suits, courthouse crowds, and a run of failed prosecutions turned him into a public symbol of mafia power. At the same time, federal agents and New York detectives were collecting something more useful than headlines. They were learning where he went, who came to him, and where private conversations happened. Gotti's public image formed quickly after the Castellano murder. He was younger than the boss he replaced, comfortable around cameras, and easy for newspapers to turn into a character. Reporters focused on his tailored clothing and confident appearances. The name Dapper Don followed. After prosecutors failed to convict him in several heavily covered cases, another label appeared, the Teflon Don, a reference to charges that seemed unable to stick. Those labels made good newspaper copy, but they can distort what was happening legally. Federal investigators continued watching Gotti throughout his run of courtroom victories, building new cases, while newspapers increasingly portrayed him as a boss prosecutors could not reach. Some earlier cases also contained evidence of witness intimidation and corruption that complicated the clean public image of a defendant simply beating weak prosecutions. One of the clearest examples involved Romuald Pisik. Pisik had reported being assaulted in a traffic dispute involving Gotti and another man. He initially identified Gotti. As the case moved forward, intimidation became a central issue. Pisik eventually withdrew his identification, and the prosecution collapsed. Later court records treated the intimidation surrounding him as part of the history of Gotti's attempts to interfere with legal proceedings. That episode mattered because it showed the limits of a prosecution built around one frightened witness. A victim can identify someone, then refuse to repeat the identification in court. A jury cannot convict on what investigators believe happened. The case helped strengthen Gotti's reputation in the press, but it also reinforced a lesson for federal prosecutors. A future case would need evidence that could survive, even if a witness changed his mind. Another prosecution ended in acquittal, and later became connected to allegations of jury corruption. The details of each old case are less important than the pattern they created. Every failed prosecution increased the public idea that Gotti could walk into court and walk back out. Investigators saw the opposite challenge. They needed a case built from evidence that the family could not easily frighten, influence, or remove. That pushed surveillance to the center of the strategy. Physical surveillance could establish routines. Agents could watch Gotti arrive at a social club, see which captains and associates appeared, note how long meetings lasted, and compare those patterns with criminal events. None of that proved a murder or extortion by itself, but it mapped the organization around the boss. The FBI and New York Police Department kept watching through the late 1980s. Archival FBI footage from 1988 through 1990 shows Gotti and other organized crime figures moving through ordinary New York streets and entering familiar locations. The footage gains its value through repetition, with the same people repeatedly appearing around the same boss and familiar locations over months and years. A hierarchy becomes easier to understand when the same people repeatedly come to the same man. Physical surveillance and electronic surveillance solved different parts of the same problem. Watching the street could show that a captain arrived shortly before another senior figure, that a visitor came repeatedly, or that a meeting happened after a particular event. A microphone could capture words but might not identify every person referenced. Used together, the two methods allowed agents to compare what they saw outside with what participants said inside. That comparison mattered in a hierarchy where the boss could deny direct involvement in street-level crimes. Investigators could establish that a person connected to a crew met with senior leaders, then examined conversations for discussion of the same dispute or business. One observation rarely proved much by itself. Repeated patterns created a stronger picture of who carried information upward and who had authority to answer. The strategy also reduced dependence on chance. Earlier organized crime cases sometimes turned on whether one witness survived, cooperated, and remained willing to testify. Long-term surveillance created evidence even during periods when nobody inside the family was cooperating. If an insider eventually did come forward, investigators would have an independent record against which that account could be checked. The Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street became one of the most important locations. Gotti used the club regularly, and members and associates gathered around it. From the street, the Ravenite looked like a small neighborhood social club. For investigators, it offered a fixed point where relationships inside the Gambino family could be observed. A fixed point also creates a problem for the people using it. A secret meeting place is much harder to monitor if investigators do not know where it is. The Ravenite was known. Agents could watch entrances, identify visitors, and seek judicial permission for electronic surveillance when they developed the legal basis to do so. Gotti and the people around him understood that risk. Sensitive conversations were not always held in the main room downstairs. Federal court records later described discussions in an apartment above the Ravenite, a location used because the participants believed it offered more privacy. The effort to avoid surveillance became part of the evidence because investigators eventually reached that space too. On November 30th, 1989, federal agents captured conversations in the apartment above the club. Other recordings followed during the same broad period. The government was no longer relying only on an informant describing what Gotti supposedly said months earlier. Jurors could eventually hear the voices themselves. Electronic surveillance still had limits. Mafia figures did not always speak in complete explanations. They used nicknames, references, gestures, and shared knowledge that an outsider might misunderstand. A sentence could make perfect sense to people in the room and remain unclear to an agent hearing it later. That is why the investigation still needed context from people who understood the hierarchy. Yet the recordings gave prosecutors something earlier Gotti cases had lacked. A tape cannot decide to disappear because it is frightened. Once lawfully recorded and admitted, the conversation remains the same. Defense lawyers can challenge what the words mean, but they cannot make the sound itself forget who was speaking. The recordings also helped establish the practical structure around Gotti. A boss is not identified only because newspapers call him one. The important evidence is who reports to him, what matters reach him, how other members react to his decisions, and whether senior figures treat his approval as necessary. Repeated meetings and conversations allowed prosecutors to build that picture through conduct rather than reputation. Gotti's public routine made the contrast stronger. His court appearances drew crowds. Photographers waited outside. Supporters gathered around him. The media image suggested a man who benefited from being seen. Investigators benefited too, because the people seeking his company helped show where authority was concentrated. This does not mean fame caused his conviction. The federal case that eventually defeated him depended on court-authorized surveillance, years of investigative work, cooperating witnesses, and evidence tied to specific crimes. Visibility was one vulnerability among several. It mattered because it created repeated opportunities for investigators to study the organization around him. The legal pressure increased in 1989 and 1990. Federal agents had recordings, physical surveillance, and growing evidence connecting senior Gambino figures to racketeering activity. They were also investigating old murders that had placed Gotti in power. The Castellano and Bellotti killings were no longer only famous unsolved crimes. Prosecutors were building a case that would accuse Gotti of ordering them. The case also reached people around him. Frank Locascio had become a senior Gambino figure. Salvatore Gravano was serving as underboss. Thomas Gambino was part of the leadership circle. The government's target was therefore larger than one celebrity defendant. Prosecutors were trying to show the administration of a criminal enterprise and the crimes through which it operated. That distinction mattered because Gotti's public image could become a distraction inside a courtroom. A jury did not need to decide whether he was charming, arrogant, fashionable, or famous. It needed evidence of racketeering acts and leadership. The government had spent years building a record designed to move attention away from the headlines and towards specific conversations and conduct. The private apartment above the Ravenite became especially valuable in that shift. Participants used it because they believed the location was safer for sensitive discussions than the club below. Investigators obtained authorization and listened anyway. A precaution taken to protect the organization became proof that the government had reached beyond the public room where everyone expected surveillance. The pattern repeated the problem that had already hurt Castellano. A Gambino boss needed a place to discuss matters that could not be handled on the street. Castellano had used his home. Gotti's circle used a social club and nearby private space. In both eras, federal agents eventually found a legal and technical route into conversations closer to the top. The difference was the amount of attention surrounding Gotti. Castellano had been famous in law enforcement circles and in organized crime reporting, but Gotti became a broader public figure. Every acquittal increased the legend. Every photograph of him walking free made the next prosecution more important to federal authorities, who were being portrayed as unable to reach him. The Teflon label therefore carried an unintended risk. It turned an ordinary racketeering defendant into a symbol of whether law enforcement could prosecute the Mafia at all. Federal agencies had institutional reasons to devote resources to a case that could answer that embarrassment. Gotti did not create RICO, wiretaps, informants, or surveillance by becoming famous, but his notoriety ensured that every one of those tools would be used aggressively. The investigation reached its turning point in December 1990. Federal agents and New York detectives moved against Gotti and other senior figures. He was arrested and placed into a case far larger than the earlier prosecutions that had produced his public legend. The charges were built around racketeering. They included the murders of Castellano and Bellotti, other acts of violence, gambling, loan sharking, Vogins, obstruction, and leadership of the Gambino enterprise. The government was no longer asking a jury to believe one victim in one assault case. It was presenting years of evidence designed to show an organization and the boss at its center. Gotti's arrest did not mean the government had already won. The case still had to survive motions, evidentiary fights, defense attacks, and a jury trial. The recordings had to be explained. Witnesses had to be credible enough to withstand cross-examination. Prosecutors had to connect individual crimes to the enterprise without asking jurors to convict, simply because the defendant was famous. The administration also entered the case together, which created pressure inside the defense. Men who had once relied on a common code of silence now faced the possibility of life sentences based on evidence the government had collected while they believed they were speaking privately. That pressure would become decisive in the next stage. The Ravenite captured both sides of Gotti's power. To supporters and associates, it was a place where the boss could be found. To investigators, that same predictability made it a map. Cars arrived, men entered, meetings repeated. Surveillance teams could watch those patterns long enough to identify which visitors returned and which figures carried authority. The public image of Gotti standing outside court in an expensive suit suggested that visibility was strength. The investigative record was quietly reaching the opposite conclusion. A boss could not control what every camera, microphone, visitor, or frightened associate would eventually contribute to a federal case. By December 1990, the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don were both still useful newspaper labels, but neither described the legal position he now faced. Gotti was in federal custody, with an indictment built from a much deeper record than the cases he had beaten before. The investigators who had spent years watching the Ravenite no longer needed to prove he was visible. They needed someone who could explain what the hidden conversations meant. The last image of this stage is the club on Mulberry Street. Its door had opened for captains, soldiers, associates, and a boss whose public reputation depended partly on being seen. Federal surveillance turned those entrances into evidence of relationships. The next danger would come from inside those relationships. when one of the men closest to Gotti decided to explain them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The government had tapes, surveillance, and a racketeering indictment, but organized crime conversations rarely came with explanations attached. One defendant sitting beside Gotti understood the hierarchy from the inside, and his decision would change what years of recorded words could prove. Section 8. Sammy Gravano and the Collapse of Silence. Salvatore Gravano entered the federal case as Gotti's underboss, not as an outsider looking for a story to sell. Prosecutors already had years of surveillance and recorded conversations, but tapes could still be argued over. Gravano knew who held authority, what coded references meant, and which decisions belonged to whom. When he agreed to cooperate, evidence that had been collected from outside gained an explanation from inside the administration. The prosecution had been building toward that moment for years. Gotti was arrested in December 1990 with other senior Gambino figures, and the government continued refining the charges, while lawyers fought over evidence and procedure. The case was meant to be broader and stronger than the prosecutions that had helped create the Teflon Don reputation. On July 18, 1991, a federal grand jury returned a 13-count superseding indictment. John Gotti, Frank Locascio, Salvatore Gravano, and Thomas Gambino were among the defendants. The charges described Gotti as the head of the Gambino family and accused members of the group of participating in a racketeering enterprise involving murder, gambling, loan sharking, obstruction, and other crimes. The government did not need Gravano merely to repeat that Gotti was the boss. Investigators had surveillance showing who came to meetings. They had recordings in which Gotti spoke with senior figures. They had evidence from the Ravenite and the apartment above it. The harder problem was interpretation. Organized crime conversations often assumed that everyone in the room already knew the background. A speaker could refer to a person by a nickname or leave a name out completely. A discussion about fixing a problem could make sense to participants without identifying the underlying crime. A boss could approve a decision in a few words because the detailed proposal had already moved through several people before reaching him. A jury hearing only the recording might understand the tone while missing the structure. An insider could connect those pieces. A participant could identify who was being discussed, explain why one man's approval mattered, describe where someone stood in the hierarchy, and connect an apparently vague conversation to events that happened before or after it. That did not make every insider statement automatically true. It made the testimony testable against evidence that already existed. That distinction is central to the strength of the 1992 case. Gravano's cooperation did not erase the need for corroboration. Prosecutors could compare his account with tapes, surveillance, dates, meetings, and other witnesses. Defense lawyers could attack his criminal history and the benefits he expected from cooperation. The jury could evaluate both the witness and the independent evidence around him. At some point after the superseding indictment, Gravano changed course. He pleaded guilty to a racketeering charge and entered a cooperation agreement with the government. No verified record establishes a single private breaking point behind that decision. He was facing a major federal prosecution and chose to cooperate. The plea and the testimony that followed document the decision itself without establishing every private reason behind it. Gravano had knowledge from near the top. He could describe Gotti's leadership, the roles of other senior figures, the organization's decision-making, and criminal events that prosecutors had been investigating for years. His position made the testimony especially damaging because he was not describing the family from the edge. He had served directly beneath Gotti. The Castellano and Bellotti murders became one of the most important parts of the case. Those killings had placed Gotti at the top in 1985. For years, the public knew the basic scene outside Sparks Steakhouse, and investigators suspected the leadership change was tied to the attack. The federal case now aimed to establish responsibility in court rather than leave the event as organized crime history. Electronic evidence helped. Conversations recorded around Gotti and other members gave prosecutors the defendant's own words. Gravano's testimony helped place those words inside a chain of events. The government argued that the murders formed part of the racketeering enterprise and helped explain how Gotti's leadership had been obtained and maintained over the years that followed. The murder charges also demonstrated why racketeering law changed organized crime prosecutions. Castellano and Bellotti had been killed in 1985, while other alleged rackets continued before and after those murders. Prosecutors could present the killings as part of a larger enterprise, instead of forcing jurors to view the leadership assassination in isolation from gambling, loan sharking, and obstruction. The government's theory was that the crimes helped create, protect, or profit the same organization. That broader structure gave the jury a timeline. Gotti's rise after the Sparks murders could be placed beside later conversations showing how he exercised authority. Gravano's position could be traced from senior member to underboss. Locaccio's role could be considered through meetings and recorded discussions. Instead of one dramatic allegation carrying the whole case, the government built a series of connected acts across several years. The defense still had room to attack every connection. It could argue that a recorded phrase meant something else, that a cooperating witness was lying for leniency, or that association with criminals did not prove participation in a particular crime. The 6-week trial mattered because jurors had time to hear those competing explanations before deciding whether the government had met its burden on each count. The trial began in February 1992 in federal court in Brooklyn. Security was heavy because of the defendants, the witnesses, and the history of intimidation around organized crime cases. The public attention was enormous. Gotti had spent years becoming the most recognizable mafia boss in the country, and the government was now asking a jury to decide charges that could keep him in prison for the rest of his life. Gravano took the stand and testified at length. His criminal history was impossible to hide, and the defense had every reason to emphasize it. A cooperating witness who admits serious crimes arrives with obvious credibility problems. Prosecutors use such witnesses because the people with direct knowledge of secret criminal organizations are rarely people with clean backgrounds. The government presented the case as a combination. Surveillance established relationships. Electronic recordings captured conversations. Other evidence documented rackets and violent acts. Gravano supplied context from inside the family. Each category covered weaknesses in the others. On April 2, 1992, the jury returned its verdict. Gotti was convicted on all 13 counts against him. The convictions included responsibility for ordering the murders of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti. The event that had made him boss 6 years earlier was now part of the judgment that would remove him from the street permanently. The verdict then moved into the ordinary appellate process rather than ending as a single dramatic courtroom moment. Gotti and Locaccio challenged the convictions, giving a federal appellate court the chance to review the legal rulings that had shaped the trial. The court did not retry witnesses from the beginning. It examined whether reversible legal errors required the judgments to be disturbed. The convictions were affirmed. The appellate result strengthened the legal status of that finding. Gotti's responsibility for the Castellano and Bellotti murders was no longer only a jury verdict facing immediate review. The convictions remained valid after appeal and became part of the settled legal history against the Gambino family leadership within the federal record. The life sentence also changed what leadership meant. Gotti could remain important as a name and could communicate within the limits imposed by prison, but he could not reproduce the daily physical presence that had made the Ravenite a center of his administration. Decisions outside now had to be carried by other people, increasing the practical importance of senior acting leaders and ruling panels. Frank Locaccio was also convicted. Gotti later received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The appellate court affirmed the convictions. The boss, whose public reputation had been built around surviving prosecutions, had reached a case in which the central charges held through verdict and appeal. The result also gave the Sparks murder a different factual status from many other mafia killings discussed in the family history. Before 1992, Gotti's role had been an investigative and historical conclusion, supported by evidence, but not yet established through his conviction. After the verdict, a federal jury had found that he ordered the murders beyond reasonable doubt. The trial converted one of the most famous Gambino allegations into an adjudicated fact. Gravano's cooperation produced benefits for him, as cooperation agreements are designed to do. The defense used that reality to attack his credibility. He was testifying with clear self-interest, and the jury had to decide whether other evidence supported his account strongly enough to believe him where it mattered. The jury's verdict shows that prosecutors succeeded on that point. It does not mean every statement Gravano ever made about organized crime became true by association. Later books, interviews, and public appearances contain claims extending far beyond the specific findings of the 1992 trial. Those later claims require their own support, even though Gravano was an important witness in one successful federal criminal case. The organizational lesson was larger than one witness. Gotti's power depended on people below him understanding his authority and following his decisions. The same structure meant an underboss had access to information that a low-level associate could never provide. Keeping the hierarchy secret required loyalty from the people who knew the most. Once that loyalty failed, years of caution could unwind backward. A meeting that had seemed safe in 1989 could be explained in 1992. A coded reference that had protected a speaker at the moment it was recorded could become understandable after a witness identified the people involved. Silence had protected the organization, not only in the present, but also by keeping old evidence incomplete. Cooperation reached into the past. That is why Gravano's decision damaged more than Gotti. A criminal family survives partly by teaching participants that talking to investigators is more dangerous than going to prison. When a man at the level of underboss cooperates and remains available to testify, everyone has to reconsider how much another member may eventually reveal. The immediate legal result was still personal. Gotti went to federal prison. He never returned to the street as a free man, and died in custody in June 2002. The era in which his physical presence at the Ravenites served as the visible center of the family was over. The organization did not end with him. That is where the larger Gambino angle separates from a simple boss biography. A fictional empire centered completely on one man can collapse when the man is removed. The Gambino family still had crews, captains, rackets, labor relationships, and people capable of serving and acting leadership positions. Those people inherited a damaged organization. Its most famous boss was serving life. Its former underboss had become a government witness. Federal investigators had demonstrated that electronic surveillance could reach private leadership conversations. Racketeering law could connect crimes across crews. The old assumption that silence would protect every layer had been weakened by one of the highest-ranking cooperators in Mafia history. Yet the same structure that made Gravano dangerous also made survival possible. He could explain a hierarchy because the hierarchy already existed beyond Gotti. Captains still had crews. Crews still knew how to generate money. Someone could carry decisions between levels even if the formal boss was in prison. The 13-count verdict ended the Teflon Don era in court, without establishing that the family itself had been dismantled. During the next decade, acting bosses, waterfront rackets, construction extortion, and repeated prosecutions of entire administrations would show how much of the organization remained capable of functioning after its most famous boss disappeared into prison. The evidence that once seemed incomplete had become more useful. Investigators had spent years collecting conversations from rooms where participants believed they were protecting themselves through code and silence. Gravano did not create those recordings. He changed what a jury could understand when it heard them. On April 2, 1992, the public result came down as 13 guilty counts. Behind that number was a more important structural failure. The family had survived cameras, wiretaps, and previous prosecutions, while insiders remained quiet. One underboss chose a different path, and the boss at the center of the organization's most visible era never walked free again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gotti's life sentence removed the family member everyone recognized, but it left the lower structure intact. The next test was less cinematic and more important. Whether acting bosses, captains, unions, construction interests, and tribute could keep functioning after the famous administration was gone. Section 9. The family that survived its own decapitation. John Gotti's life sentence looked like the kind of ending organized crime investigations had chased for decades. The boss was gone, his underboss had cooperated, and electronic surveillance had exposed senior conversations. Yet a mafia family is built with offices below the boss, precisely so work can continue when one man disappears. The years after 1992 became a test of whether prosecutors had removed a leader or broken the machine beneath him. The first fact to keep clear is that Gotti remained an important name after he entered prison, but he could no longer run a street organization through ordinary daily contact. Federal restrictions, prison rules, monitored visits, and the practical limits of incarceration made direct leadership harder. Other men had to carry responsibilities outside. That is where acting leadership became important. The acting boss role carries practical authority because a criminal organization still needs someone to handle decisions when the formal boss is unavailable and daily problems continue outside prison. Captains need disputes resolved. Money continues moving. Relationships with other families and outside businesses still create problems that cannot wait for a distant figure in prison. Peter Gotti, John's older brother, eventually became one of those acting leaders. Federal appellate courts later described him as acting boss of the Gambino family. That status is important because it appears in judicial records rather than only newspaper speculation about who held power after John's conviction. The organization Peter inherited was weaker and more exposed than the family Carlo Gambino had led. Federal agents understood its hierarchy better. Cooperators had explained relationships. RICO cases had become standard weapons against organized crime. The government could target a crew, an industry, or an entire administration with methods developed through the prosecutions of the 1980s and early 1990s. Yet the old economic interests remained valuable. One of the clearest examples was the New York waterfront. For decades, Mafia families had treated docks, shipping, and longshore labor as sources of influence and money. A port brings together employers, unions, workers, cargo, trucking, schedules, and businesses that lose money when movement stops. That creates opportunities for extortion and labor pressure, even when the famous boss associated with the family is sitting in prison. A later federal prosecution described Gambino influence over labor unions, companies, and individuals working at piers in Brooklyn and Staten Island. The case involved allegations and evidence of extortion, labor corruption, and tribute payments moving upward. That last detail matters because tribute reveals hierarchy in financial form. Money collected at one level does not necessarily stay there. A portion can move toward people with greater authority. Waterfront influence was valuable because the docks could not function as isolated workplaces. Shipping companies depended on cargo being loaded and unloaded on time. Truckers depended on access. Employers depended on labor. Workers depended on hiring systems and union representation. Pressure applied at one point could affect several businesses farther along the chain. That environment rewarded people who could present themselves as intermediaries. A company facing a labor problem might be told that a particular person could make the problem disappear. The payment could be described as the cost of peace rather than an open theft. Federal prosecutors treated those arrangements as extortion when the underlying leverage came from threats, corruption, or the ability to cause economic harm. The post-Gotti cases placed those methods in judicial records after the famous boss was already gone. Prosecutors described money moving upward from waterfront activity, without Gotti standing on a pier. The racket depended on access to workers, businesses, and unions, rather than on the public profile of the administration. The waterfront record therefore showed the family operating through the same basic logic that had protected earlier bosses. A senior leader did not need to appear at every pier. People closer to the work could pressure businesses or individuals. Captains and administration figures could benefit from activity occurring several steps away. Peter Gotti's cases also showed how unfinished business from John's era continued into the next administration. Salvatore Gravano had testified against John Gotti and helped prosecutors explain the evidence that produced the 1992 convictions. To the family, his cooperation remained a betrayal, with consequences beyond one trial. Federal appellate records later documented a conspiracy to kill Gravano. During a prison visit in September 1996, John Gotti urged Peter to have Gravano killed. Peter, who would serve as acting boss, assigned Gambino members to pursue the plan. The conspiracy moved beyond angry conversation into preparation. Members connected to the effort traveled to Arizona, where Gravano was living. They conducted surveillance and explored ways to reach him. The activity showed a prison boss's old grievance being carried through people outside, using the same layered structure that allowed the organization to function when senior figures were physically separated from the street. The plot did not succeed. Gravano was arrested in Arizona in February 2000 on an unrelated drug case before the Gambino plan produced the intended killing. The federal prosecution of Peter Gotti later included the murder conspiracy, and his conviction was affirmed on appeal. He received a 25-year sentence. That episode undermines the idea that the family after John Gotti was simply a name attached to old men remembering the past. People were still receiving assignments, traveling across the country, conducting surveillance, and acting on decisions that originated higher in the hierarchy. The organization had lost power, but it retained the ability to coordinate criminal activity. Construction offered another example. Cooperating witnesses in Peter Gotti's federal case described Gambino extortion connected to the industry. One witness estimated the family made tens of millions of dollars through that activity. That figure came from testimony rather than an audited financial statement. The same case separately documented labor pressure, work stoppages, violence, and no-work jobs connected to the construction extortion. Companies could face pressure through unions, work stoppages, threats, violence, or demands for jobs that required little or no actual work. A contractor operating on a schedule has strong incentives to avoid labor disruption. Organized crime could exploit that vulnerability by presenting itself as the solution to a problem it had the power to create. That model did not require the public presence of John Gotti. In fact, it worked better without a celebrity boss attracting cameras. A construction company might deal with a local figure, a union official, or an associate whose connection to the family was not obvious to outsiders. The money could still move upward, while the leadership remained several steps away. The post-Gotti period therefore looked less dramatic in newspapers, but more familiar in court. Waterfront extortion, construction pressure, gambling, loans, and tribute depended on relationships, fear, and a hierarchy capable of enforcing decisions, with no celebrity boss required at the point where money changed hands. Federal prosecutors continued trying to remove those layers. Cases during the late 1990s and 2000s repeatedly targeted acting bosses, captains, soldiers, associates, and business relationships. Each successful prosecution could weaken the family, but the government faced the same structural problem in reverse. Arresting one administration created an opening for another group of senior figures to assume responsibilities. That problem reached an extraordinary point in February 2008. Federal prosecutors in New York unsealed a huge Gambino indictment charging 62 defendants. The case accused members and associates of crimes involving construction extortion, union activity, gambling, money laundering, loan sharking, theft, and violence. At the moment of indictment, those accusations remained allegations. The size of an indictment does not turn every count into a fact. The historically important statement came from the Justice Department's description of the leadership target. Prosecutors said, every member of the Gambino administration then at liberty had been charged. The list included acting boss John D'Amico, acting underboss Domenico Cefalu, and consigliere Joseph Carrozzo, along with captains, acting captains, soldiers, and associates. The government was no longer claiming success because it had arrested one famous boss. It was attempting to remove the entire senior structure available on the street at the same time. The 2008 case also involved cooperation with Italian authorities, showing that relationships around the Gambino family still extended beyond New York. The international dimension showed that law enforcement still treated the remaining network as something worth attacking across jurisdictions, while the available evidence did not establish a return to the strength the organization held in earlier decades. A takedown that large creates an obvious operational problem for a criminal organization. Decisions still have to be made the next day. Crews still exist. Pending disputes do not disappear because the administration has been arrested. People seeking permission or protection still need someone to answer. Later federal trial evidence provided a rare look at how the Gambino family responded. Bartolomeo Vernas was a longtime member who eventually became a captain. In 2013, a federal jury convicted him of racketeering conspiracy and other crimes. Prosecutors presented evidence that, after the 2008 administration arrests, Vernas served on a 3-member ruling panel established to oversee the family. A ruling panel is different from a celebrity boss. Authority is distributed among several people instead of concentrated visibly in one. That can reduce the value of targeting one individual and make leadership harder to explain to outsiders. It also fits the older Gambino preference for distance far better than the public style of John Gotti. The point is narrower. The family possessed mechanisms for replacement. Formal boss, acting boss, administration, captains, and ruling panels were ways of assigning responsibility when previous leaders were unavailable. The names changed. The need for someone to settle disputes and supervise crews did not. That durability came with a price. Every new leader inherited an organization smaller, more penetrated, and more legally vulnerable than the one before. Cooperators had become common. Federal agents understood coded language and social club routines. Electronic surveillance technology improved. Financial investigations could follow legitimate companies and union funds. The family could refill offices without recreating the conditions Carlo Gambino enjoyed in the 1960s. That is why the 2008 takedown and the later ruling panel belong together. One shows the government reaching the entire administration then available. The other shows the organizational response that followed. Neither cancels the other. Law enforcement was damaging the family, and the family was still attempting to function after the damage. The same structural response had appeared repeatedly across decades. Anastasia was killed, and a new boss emerged. Carlo died and Castellano took the position. Castellano was murdered and Gotti took over. Gotti went to prison and acting leaders followed. Later administrations were indicted and a ruling panel appeared. The causes differed, but the role kept mattering beyond the person occupying it. The word administration captures the post-Gotti era more clearly than any successor. In an ordinary company, an administration can continue after a chief executive leaves. The Gambino family used a criminal version of the same principle. Crews produced money below. Senior figures coordinated above. When one group was removed, another could attempt to fill the empty function. By the end of the 2000s, however, the family had learned another lesson from Gotti's collapse. A highly visible boss offered investigators and reporters one obvious center. A panel, acting leadership, or quieter administration created less spectacle. The organization that survived the celebrity era increasingly looked closer to the low visibility model that had served it before Gotti. That change leads directly into the modern cases. By the 2020s, federal cases focused on construction companies, payroll fraud, carding, demolition, labor interests, extortion, and money laundering. A far quieter record than the crowds and headlines surrounding a new dapper don at a social club. Those industries matter because they echo the older family without proving the same level of control. Construction had appeared under Castellano. Labor and the waterfront had appeared across generations. Extortion remained useful because businesses still depended on schedules and relationships. The visible leadership changed, while the economic opportunities remained recognizable. The February 2008 indictment marked another attempt to decapitate the hierarchy at several levels at once, with prosecutors targeting senior positions across the organization rather than one famous leader. Later evidence that a three-member panel was formed shows why that strategy had to be repeated. A family organized around replaceable roles could remain alive after losing the people who had occupied them. By 2008, the important image was no longer one famous successor. Federal prosecutors believed they had cleared the administration, yet later evidence showed three men filling a ruling panel. The organization was weaker, but the function survived. Its strength depended less on a public boss than on whether those quieter positions could keep money and decisions moving. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. After decades of bosses, trials, informants, and administration takedowns, the remaining clue was economic. Recent federal cases stopped looking like the Gotti era and started looking familiar in another way, returning to contractors, unions, carding, demolition, and the ordinary businesses that had supported the family for generations. Section 10. The old rackets came back in new clothes. The public Gambino story can look finished once Gotti disappears into prison and later administrations are swept up in federal cases. The modern court record points somewhere less dramatic. Prosecutors kept finding Gambino members and associates around construction companies, payroll schemes, unions, carding, demolition, and extortion. The names and scale had changed, but the places where criminal influence tried to hide still looked familiar decades later. The clearest bridge into the modern period came through a federal case involving construction and financial crime. In January 2021, a Gambino captain and multiple members and associates pleaded guilty to charges that included racketeering conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and obstruction. Those were not newspaper allegations left waiting for trial. The defendants entered guilty pleas in federal court. One of the central figures was Andrew Campos, whom prosecutors identified as a Gambino captain. The case involved CWC contracting and schemes that moved through a legitimate-looking construction business. Federal prosecutors said the company was used in fraud and money laundering activity and failed to pay approximately $1.3 million in payroll taxes. The construction setting matters because it returns to a problem that had appeared decades earlier under Castellano. A contracting company sits inside an ordinary economy. It hires workers, handles payroll, receives payments, sends invoices, pays suppliers, and bids for jobs. Criminal conduct inside that structure can be harder to recognize than a robbery because much of the surrounding activity is legitimate. In February 2022, Campos was sentenced to 37 months in federal prison. The court also ordered $1 million in restitution and imposed a fine. During sentencing, the court found that CWC had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes or kickbacks during 2018 and 2019. That finding gave the modern construction story a legal result, rather than leaving it at the charging stage. The evidence does not support a claim that the Gambino family had rebuilt the concrete schemes of the 1980s at the same scale. The narrower connection is well documented. Members and associates of a family long associated with using legitimate industries as criminal infrastructure were still being convicted over conduct tied to a construction company decades after the bosses who made that strategy famous were gone. The next major case widened the picture. On November 8, 2023, federal prosecutors in New York announced a coordinated operation with Italian authorities. 10 defendants in the United States were charged in a 16-count indictment involving alleged racketeering conspiracy, extortion, assaults, witness retaliation, fraud, money laundering, and union-related crimes. At that moment, those claims were allegations. An indictment is an accusation, not a verdict. The chronology matters because several of the allegations would later be resolved through guilty pleas or trial, while individual counts against particular defendants had different outcomes. The business setting again looked ordinary from the outside. Prosecutors focused on New York carting and demolition companies. Carting means moving waste and debris, work that becomes essential on construction and demolition sites. A project cannot continue indefinitely if debris is not removed. Demolition companies also depend on labor, schedules, trucks, equipment, and access to future contracts. According to the 2023 indictment, Gambino members and associates tried to use extortion and union influence to gain control or advantage in parts of those industries. Prosecutors alleged that people were threatened or assaulted, businesses were pressured, and criminal relationships were used to influence who received work and how money moved. The details echoed older organized crime methods without requiring a claim that history had repeated exactly. Construction in Castellano's era involved large contracts and commission-level relationships. The modern allegations involved a smaller set of companies and defendants. The common feature was leverage over businesses where delays, labor trouble, and access to contracts carry real financial consequences. The 2023 operation also included arrests in Italy. 6 people were arrested there as part of the coordinated action. The international element showed that law enforcement still treated relationships connected to the Gambino family as capable of crossing the Atlantic. In the United States, the charged conduct remains centered on the defendants and businesses named in the New York case. The charged conduct also produced different legal outcomes for different defendants. A racketeering indictment can place several people inside one alleged enterprise while accusing them of separate acts. One person may admit a conspiracy through a guilty plea. Another may contest an individual extortion charge at trial. A third may face a separate allegation of retaliation or weapons possession. The final record, therefore, develops in pieces rather than through one verdict covering everyone. That distinction matters because public reporting on mafia cases often turns an indictment into a finished narrative on the day arrests are announced. The government is allowed to describe its theory. Defendants remain presumed innocent unless and until they plead guilty or are convicted. Following the case through 2025 and 2026 shows how several allegations later became admissions or verdicts while others were resolved differently. The defendants ultimately reached different outcomes. Some accepted responsibility through racketeering pleas. Brooke forced prosecutors to prove his case to a jury and received a mixed result. Laforte's later plea then closed the unresolved list of 10 U.S. defendants from the 2023 indictment without making their individual outcomes identical. As the case moved forward, the status of the allegations began changing. Pleas replaced accusations with admissions. Other defendants continued toward trial. The chronology matters because conduct described as an allegation in the November 2023 indictment could be stated more firmly only after a defendant admitted it or a jury returned a verdict. By October 17, 2025, 7 Gambino members and associates charged in the case had pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy. The group included Captain Joseph Lanni, soldiers Diego Tantillo, and Angelo Grattalone, and several associates. Those pleas established criminal responsibility for the defendants who entered them, even though the exact conduct admitted by each person still depended on the terms of the individual plea. One defendant, Robert Brooke, went to trial rather than resolving the case through a guilty plea. His result demonstrates why the legal distinctions matter. On December 8, 2025, a federal jury convicted Brooke of Hobbs Act extortion. The same jury acquitted him of extortion conspiracy. That split verdict blocks any claim that prosecutors proved everything they alleged against Brooke. He was convicted of one extortion offense and acquitted of the conspiracy count, leaving both outcomes in the legal record. The trial also produced a concrete incident that shows what extortion looked like away from abstract racketeering language. Evidence concerned an attack on the owner of a demolition company near 50th Street and 8th Avenue in Manhattan on December 18, 2019. The victim suffered a fractured cheekbone, a black eye, and other facial injuries. Payments followed the assault. The attack connects the modern business scheme to a concrete consequence. Demolition may sound like paperwork, trucks, and contracts, but the criminal pressure alleged around it still depended on a person understanding that refusal could bring physical harm. The last unresolved defendant from the 2023 U.S. indictment reached his own legal turning point on February 4, 2026. James Lafort pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy, Hobbs Act extortion offenses, witness retaliation, and unlawful firearm possession. The Justice Department identified Lafort as the last of the 10 defendants from the 2023 indictment to either plead guilty or be convicted at trial. His plea closed the defendant list without erasing the different outcomes inside it, including guilty pleas, Brooke's extortion conviction, and Brooke's separate acquittal on the conspiracy count. The February 2026 plea provides a clear endpoint for the guilt status of the 10 defendants as a group. It records that all 10 U.S. defendants from the 2023 indictment had pleaded guilty or been convicted at trial, without requiring speculation about later sentences, appeals, or separate investigations. Campos had already received a sentence in his earlier case, while the defendants in the later prosecution had reached pleas or verdicts. Other consequences remain separate from those guilt determinations. Modern organized crime cases continue moving after headlines fade. Sentencing dates can change. Appeals can follow. Defendants can receive different penalties based on the offenses they admitted or were convicted of. By February 2026, the completed part of this prosecution was the determination of guilt for all 10 U.S. defendants, while sentences, appeals, and other legal consequences remained separate matters. By that point, the modern case had moved through several stages of certainty. In November 2023, prosecutors alleged a broad racketeering scheme. In 2025, multiple defendants pleaded guilty, and a jury convicted Brooke of extortion while acquitting him of conspiracy. In February 2026, Lafort's plea meant every one of the 10 U.S. defendants had reached either a guilty plea or a conviction at trial. That sequence also shows why modern organized crime is often less visually dramatic than the Gotti era. There is no single photograph equivalent to Castellano, outside Sparks, or Gotti walking into the Ravenite. The story is spread across indictments, plea hearings, company records, union relationships, assaults, payments, and sentencing decisions. The machinery is harder to turn into a movie scene because much of it looks like ordinary work until the criminal connection is proved. A contracting company still pours concrete or manages a job. A carting company still moves debris. A union still represents workers. Organized crime tries to profit by inserting pressure into those ordinary systems, rather than replacing them with an entirely separate underground economy. That was one of the Gambino family's oldest advantages. It did not have to create every market it exploited. It could attach itself to industries that already had money moving through them. Construction projects already needed labor. Docks already needed longshore workers. Businesses already needed credit, trucking, waste removal, and suppliers. Criminal influence could take a portion from activity that would exist anyway. The modern cases also show the limits of that strategy. Legitimate industries create records. Payroll taxes leave records. Bank transfers leave records. Companies have owners and employees who can cooperate. Union funds can be audited. Phones can be monitored. Surveillance can capture meetings. The same ordinary business environment that creates profit can generate evidence. The contrast with Scarface becomes clearest here. Tony Montana's empire is built around a central personality whose wealth, violence, and drug business all rise together. The Gambino family survived because its money and authority could move through people who were not famous and businesses that did not look cinematic. A boss could die, go to prison, or disappear from public view while the economic opportunities remained. The evidence does not justify claiming that the modern Gambino family holds the power it once did, or exceeds the fictional empire in every era. The darker point is structural and depends on the persistence of the underlying methods. Criminal influence can become ordinary enough to sit inside a contract, a payroll, a union dispute, or a waste-hauling route without announcing itself as an empire. That structure also explains why the family history cannot be reduced to Gotti. Anastasia's death changed the boss. Carlo's death changed the boss. Castellano's murder changed the boss. Gotti's conviction changed the boss. The 2008 takedown changed the administration. None of those events erased the industries and relationships that made organized crime profitable in the first place. The absence of a new celebrity boss is itself part of the evidence. Recent federal cases identify defendants through court records and businesses through public filings without establishing a new public figure comparable to Gotti. That quieter record still shows continuity in criminal methods, while giving no basis for inventing a hidden modern empire larger than the evidence supports. The final modern prosecution therefore circles back to Castellano's era, without claiming the two periods were equal. Construction and labor had once helped make the family powerful enough to influence major New York business. Decades later, members and associates were still being prosecuted around construction, demolition, carting, fraud, and extortion on a smaller and more exposed scale. A demolition site captures the modern pattern more clearly than another portrait of a boss. Trucks arrive. Debris leaves. Workers wait on schedules. Contractors need jobs to move. None of that looks like the mythology of a mafia empire. That ordinary setting helps explain why the Gambino model could eventually outlast the individual men who controlled it. The modern Gambino era opened in 1957, with a visible boss killed in public and replaced. Nearly 7 decades later, the legal record had moved away from glamorous bosses and back into ordinary businesses, where money could still be pressured upward. The famous faces changed. The machinery kept trying to find another place to operate. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.